All right. Hello and welcome everyone. Folks are still joining us, but it's 7 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. My name is Tim Alamanchuk. I'm the communications manager at Reep Green Solutions. Welcome to the third and final installment of our Healthy Yards webinar series. This one is called How to Choose Native Perennials, Shrubs, and Trees. And it'll be delivered by Adele Pierre, who I'll introduce momentarily. Before we get started, as we're talking about native plants in this region and restoring them, I want to take a moment to reflect on the land that I'm coming to you from. So I'm in Waterloo region on the Grand River watershed. It's the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples with whom we share the land today, their achievements and their contribution to this community. We value traditional knowledge about how to live sustainably on this land that we will share and leave for future generations. All right, and I want to tell you a little bit about Reep for those who are joining us and finding out about Reep for the first time. We're an environmental charity based in Waterloo region. We focus on home energy efficiency, healthy yards, water conservation, and waste reduction. And this house that you see in the picture is the Reep House for Sustainable Living on Mill Street. It's a demonstration home where we feature many of the technologies and a beautiful garden that will soon be springing out front. As we're getting started today, we're going to be talking a lot about plants, and I wanted to take a moment to mention that our Bloom in Box sale is happening right now. So if you hear about plants that you like, you might want to check out the Bloom in Box sale. I'll put a link in the chat, and you can get a box with 15 native plant plugs for $90. If you're in Kitchener, Waterloo, or Cambridge, you can get a $45 rebate on our Bloom and Rain box, which is great for starting a rain garden. So like I mentioned at the beginning, this is the Healthy Yards webinar. It's a part of our Rain Smart Neighborhoods program that we deliver in collaboration with the City of Kitchener. One big part of that program is if you live in certain watersheds in the City of Kitchener, you can qualify for a home visit from one of our Healthy Yards advisors. They'll come out and have a look at your yard. They'll help you think about where to put a rain garden or where to put rain barrels. And they'll even draw a plan for you to follow so you can do it yourself or hire somebody to make your yard and your property rain smart. So I'll put a link in the chat as well to that program so you can get more information there. And just before I introduce our speaker, I want to do a quick poll, and we're hoping to find out where you're joining us from. So I'm going to launch the poll and it'll pop up on your screen. And we just want you to select one of the options, either Kitchener, Waterloo, or Cambridge. And if you're not from any of those, you can let us know in the chat where you're from. So I'll launch the poll and let it go for a couple minutes. And yeah, great. Well, I can see a lot of answers coming in really quickly. That's good. It's not even going to take a couple minutes. So tonight we're going to learn about what works where native plants in your yard and how to select them. Our speaker is Adele Pierre. Adele is a landscape architect and ISA certified arborist. She leads an award-winning design firm that specializes in the creation of beautiful, low-maintenance landscapes. Mindful of the effects of climate change on our natural systems, Adele incorporates native plantings in all projects to provide habitat for pollinators, build healthy soils, and manage rainwater. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will pass it over to Adele to take it from here. Oh, you're still muted, Adele.
The joys of Zoom, right? You'd think after 2 years we'd have this down pat. It's good to be with you this evening talking about my favorite topic pretty much, which is plants. I am a bit of a fanatic when it comes to plants. I am one of those people who used to just go to the nursery and buy a whole bunch of plants and bring them home and then try to figure out where to put them. I do it a little bit more carefully now because that's part of my job, but I'm still totally in love with plants and like all kinds of them. So I should tell you right up front that I am not a purist when it comes to native plants. Plants of all types are good for all kinds of things, but native plants in particular. Tim spoke about restoring habitat. In Ontario, when the settlers came and farmed, there was no such thing as a good tree. Trees were to be cleared out. And so our massive eastern hardwood forests disappeared. And so we have this landscape now, which is not at all what originally happened in this part of the world. And we're doing everything we can to restore the vegetation to its natural state, because of course the flora and fauna in this territory, in any territory, evolve together. So here's a few of the topics that we're going to be covering tonight. I realize people are from different localities. They have different kinds of soil. They have different climates, they have different water issues. So I'm going to try to give you some basic principles for choosing and designing with native plants. So we're going to start with a couple of definitions. So what is a native plant? And this is a very basic definition. It's considered native if it's occurred naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat without human introduction. And that human introduction also includes things like plant seeds coming in on the water and the ballast of a ship, all kinds of places that plants get here. So this is considered a native plant in Ontario. This is Echinacea pallida, pale coneflower, beautiful perennial native to this region. But there are a ton of plants that are not native and have been here for a very long time, and people consider them native. For instance, people think that lilacs are native because they're everywhere and they grow extremely well. They're not. So here's three newcomers. They showed up in the mid-1600s. So they've been here for 400 years, but they're still not considered native because they were brought by the European settlers. They're not particularly harmful. In fact, they're quite beneficial. If we start clockwise from the top, we have white clover, which is a wonderful plant. If you've got a lawn, you put the white clover in, it fixes nitrogen in the soil, so you don't have to fertilize your lawn. The honeybees love it, all kinds of pollinators love it. The next one, if we're going clockwise, is Canada thistle, and that is, no, it's not native. It's called Canada thistle because it's in Canada and it's really happy here. As you can see, the bees love it. It is technically, in Ontario, a noxious weed, and if it's there, you're supposed to rip it out. And that is because it has taken over pasture lands. And of course, the one on the bottom that everyone knows is the dandelions, which used to be considered a pest, but people are now saying, please leave the dandelions through May so that the bees have something to feed on when they come out of hibernation after the winter. And so I believe it's every May that the call goes out to leave those dandelions alone and leave them in your lawn. So non-natives, but they're here. There's one other category we need to know about, and these are the invasive plants. These are plants beyond their native range. They do not provide particular habitat for any of the fauna, and they do damage the environment. And they are specific to different regions. So what is invasive here may not be invasive in Alberta or in British Columbia or in Nova Scotia. These are three of the most popular garden plants ever. So if you look at the top right, we have the Crimson King maple, which is actually a type of Norway maple. Norway maples were planted everywhere because you can't kill them. The problem is you can't kill them. They produce an incredible number of maple seeds, maple keys every year, which pop down on the ground and sprout up or they go into the storm sewers and travel along the waterways and get into natural areas. It's a very aggressive grower. It's very happy here. It has a very dense canopy, and so nothing can grow underneath it. So the ravines of Toronto are almost entirely populated now by Norway maples. So it looks like it's a native natural habitat, but in fact it's not. The next one down there, that pretty little blue flower that everyone loves that will grow anywhere, vinca or periwinkle. I shudder when I have clients that live near the Hamilton Escarpment because they plant that ground cover, it starts down the escarpment and it just doesn't give up. I've been in stretches of Carolinian forest that were covered with vinca on the ground. And again, once this pretty little spreader gets its feet in the ground, not much else is growing there. And the third one, a grass, everyone loves this. This is Miscanthus sinensis, or Japanese grass. And it is, there are many varieties of it. It's a gorgeous grass, but again, it is getting into our wild regions and outcompeting everything else. Now, these plants are still grown and sold in garden centers along with many others. Do yourself a favor if you're not sure if something is invasive. There's a wonderful little brochure put out by Landscape Ontario. It's called Beautiful Non-Invasive Plants for Your Garden, Grow Me Instead. It's worth picking up a copy because the first rule of naturalizing your garden is do no harm. So you don't want any of those invasives in your yard. Now, some of the benefits of plants. They provide beauty. They also provide an incredible number of eco-services. One of my favorite is that they slow down the flow of stormwater, allowing it to infiltrate back into the soil and go into the groundwater. In fact, this is the reason I went back to school to become a landscape architect. I was concerned about flooding and the sewage overflow into Lake Ontario. I figured there had to be a better way of treating our water. They return water vapor to the atmosphere. You know that if you're sitting under a tree in the summer, it's a lot cooler than if you're not sitting under a tree. They remove toxins, even bad ones. There's an invasive plant called Phragmites that is a reed that you see filling all the ditches along the rural roads in Ontario. And it's out competing everything. But what it does better than anything else is remove pollutants from the water. So all of that water that's coming off of the highway, off the 401, off the 400, off the QEW, when it goes into those ditches, it's being filtered by Phragmites. The trees and shrubs sequester carbon, and of course they provide pollinator habitat. You can see all kinds of other fancy names there on that little graph. You can look it up. Plants are amazing what they can do for us. Now, this little picture here is in my garden, and this is a very happy bee buried deep in Linares, and it's the common name of this wildflower is butter and eggs, and it is not a native. It's a non-native plant. It's an alien species. So what's the problem with that if we're providing habitat for pollinators? Well, these flowers that provide nectar for bees are providing basically food. So we have here a monarch that is on a peony, just waiting for it to open up, and it's going to bury its nose in that when it opens up. The monarch butterflies feed off of the lilacs, they feed off of the roses, they feed off of all kinds of plants. So you ask, what's the issue? I've heard that monarchs only like milkweed. Well, these adult insects are kind of like human adults. They can eat a wide range of foods, and it's just fine. But the babies can't. So this is the monarch caterpillar. Monarchs have evolved to be the feeders of milkweed. Many insects cannot eat milkweed. When they eat it, there's a milky sap that comes out and it gums up their mouth parts together. The monarchs have figured out a unique way of feeding on the leaves. I'll leave that to you to find out. But trust me when I say they will only lay their eggs on milkweed, and the caterpillars will only eat milkweed. Now, this is true for many of our native pollinators. So why are the caterpillars so important? Well, you start thinking about the food chain. You've heard that the songbird populations are collapsing. One of the reasons those songbird populations are collapsing is because they feed on caterpillars. You take away a major food source like this, and the birds can't nest, they can't raise their young. And milkweed has been cleaned out because we've considered it to be a nuisance weed. People don't want it. It springs up where you don't want it in the garden. It just grows wherever it feels like, but it is wiping out populations of insects. Now, how can you find out what plants will be beneficial for caterpillars and pollinators? Well, wherever you live, I can assure you that your conservation authority provides a wealth of information. So this is from the Grand River Conservation Authority. If you've never been to their website, go. You can map your property. You can find out what kind of soil you have, what's the superficial geology, what's the base geology. You can find out all kinds of information, but they've also got stuff like this, and they'll tell you what kinds of trees and shrubs provide habitat for what. It's a wonderful resource. So you can see the pollinators and the other benefits. So if you look down there, like the Prunus serratina, the black cherry, it's a larval host for many butterflies and moths. So your conservation authority is a great place to start. Now, there are a number of trees that are really beneficial, and I'm just going to switch to another little photo here. I'll just leave that right there. These are the keystone species. In other words, the key species for pollinators and caterpillars in our ecoregion, which is the eastern hardwood forests. And you can see that right there, that when you look at the quercus or the oaks right on top, 436 caterpillar species use this as a host plant. So you can see with the trees, there's not a lot of pollinators on there, but the caterpillars that will become the pollinators are feeding on those leaves. I will go back to my other one, and I'll just tell you that my mother recently passed away at the ripe age of 97, she was a major gardener. I learned everything from her. But my mom, one of her functions in life was to feed people. She was an amazing cook. She fed everybody that came her way, fed them till they were stuffed. When she died, in her memory, I planted a white oak, because you can see that Quercus alba is a host plant for 436 caterpillar species. If you got a room, plant an oak. And as you can see as well from this list, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 trees feed 90% of all species of caterpillars and moths. So even if you don't care about caterpillars, care about the birds, this is the bottom of the food chain. So we need to start at the bottom and provide habitat through the trees that we plant. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about trees. There are some limitations. And this is true whether you live in the city or in the country. Size matters. If there are hydro lines anywhere near you, take this to heart. If you plant a great big maple underneath a hydro line, Ontario Hydro is going to come, totally justified, and chop the head off of your tree or decimate it. It will not do well. Make sure that there is room to plant the tree that you want. This is a little graphic from the Arbor Day Foundation, wonderful organization, but Oakville Hydro, Brampton Hydro, Kitchener Hydro, almost every hydro has a graphic like this because they're so concerned about ice storms weighing down the branches of trees and the branches falling off and taking down the hydro lines. So make sure that you have a tree that fits in that spot. So size really does matter. Also, in terms of size, large trees should be at least 20 feet apart. Make sure that you give trees room to grow. Plant a minimum of 7 feet from hard surfaces. In any battle between a tree and a sidewalk, the tree is going to win. Trees can break down mountains. Now, that tree is not particularly happy. It's coming out of the ground. The roots are girdled, so nobody's happy. The tree's not happy. The sidewalk's not happy. Keep the trees at least 7 feet away from all of these built surfaces. Plant a minimum of 5 feet from property lines or fences. I was astonished when I saw this trunk growing right through a chain link fence. I found that when I go to design someone's property, the first thing they want to do is jam a tree right up against a fence line. Just bear in mind that your neighbor is perfectly entitled to chop off any part of that tree that goes over their fence. So they could legitimately cut off half of the tree. So make sure that you keep your tree somewhere where those pruners aren't going to decimate it. If you are in doubt about what kind of trees would work in your area and what kind of conditions they would require, there is this wonderful, wonderful resource called the Ontario Tree Atlas online. You just Google it. You go in there, there is a map of Ontario, you click on your region, and a list of the native trees to your region comes up. You click on the tree, it will tell you everything you want to know. It will tell you whether it likes sandy soil, loamy soil, clay soil, whether it likes wet soil or dry soil, how tall it grows, how wide it grows, whether it likes a sheltered place, whether it likes an open space. It's an amazing resource. So when you're looking for your native tree, take a look at this website. It's going to tell you a lot. Now, I'm going to just tell you about a couple of trees that I think are quite neglected. And I find mostly we're an urban society right now, so I'm betting most of the people on this call live in a city. And there are 3 native trees, you would have seen them listed on the hydrographic, that grow extremely well and provide all kinds of habitat for pollinators and for birds. One of them is the Circus canadensis, the red bud, that has beautiful flowers really early in the spring, way before the leaves come out. So it's providing nectar and pollen for the very early, the bees and the pollinators that are coming out first thing. The next one on the right, this is a wonderful picture. This was taken by a client of mine. This was a serviceberry that she wanted to chop down because she thought it was so messy. I pled with her to get it pruned properly. She did. She put a light on it at night, and it just looks beautiful with this starry white, with the starry white flowers. So again, the bees love it in the spring. The birds love it in the summer. I have 6 planted on our property, and we have yet to get one berry off of that bush because the cedar waxwings beat us to it every year. And the pagoda dogwood, beautiful white flowers again in spring, and fruit again in the summer and in the fall. So these are wonderful small trees. Every garden that I design, every garden I design has a serviceberry in it. This is another one that I think is underused. This is the hop hornbeam. Another word for it is ironwood, Austria virginiana. And it's sort of a medium-sized tree. So it's going to get about 30 feet tall and wide. So it's not huge like a maple or an oak, but it's a wonderful tree for an urban property. Just doesn't take up too much space. Very, very pretty. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the evergreens. So you would have seen on those lists that I put up about beneficial trees, pine was right near the top. Spruce is there as well. This is our native white pine. Most urban properties do not have room for this tree, but if you've got the space They take up about 30 feet. They're 30 feet wide. And please don't say that you'll prune it, because you can't prune a tree that big enough without it suffering. The white pine grows in rocky outcrops, as you can see here. So you're going to take your cue for whether or not those trees are going to work on your property based on where they live naturally. So pines tend to do well in a really lean soil, a rocky soil, a sandy soil, a very well-drained soil. Spruce, on the other hand, this is at my property, this is white spruce. Spruce is happy with its in a much more mucky soil. I keep trying to plant pines, they keep dying on me. But these spruce become bird condominiums in the fall and in the winter and the spring, because these evergreens, along with this one, which is Juniperus virginiana, otherwise known as red cedar, it's not really a cedar, provide amazing shelter and protection and food for all kinds of fauna, not just birds and pollinators, but small mammals, deer, all kinds of animals are very thankful for these trees. Now, I'm going to talk next about shrubs, and I'm going to give you some alternative shrubs, ones that are smaller in stature than the native varieties. But when it comes to these conifers, the pine, the spruce, and the juniper, once you get to the smaller varieties like a dwarf white pine, it looks very pretty, but it does not have the same ecological benefits that the straight native species does. If you try to plant a blue spruce, it will have some of those benefits. It is not native to our area. And right now, most of the blue spruces are being wiped out by fungal disease. So the white spruce is really the way to go. They only get about 13 feet wide in diameter, so they're great for an urban property. I'm going to keep an eye on the time because I want to allow a lot of time for questions, but maybe we'll allow just a few minutes right now for questions if somebody has any. Tim, would you like to?
Yeah, sorry, Adele, there was a question in the chat from Irene. Is it better to plant trees, deciduous or evergreen, in the fall or spring in Southern Ontario?
In my opinion, the fall is the best time, and I will give you the reasons. In the fall, if you plant, the tree is not putting out any new growth. The leaves have likely dropped or they're close to dropping. And so it's going down basically into hibernation. But when you plant it in the soil is still warm. So the roots can start to grow and it will get a head start. The other reason I think it's good is because you don't have to worry about watering. We get lots of rain in the fall, and so those trees get watered in. Now, traditionally, spring is a good time to plant, but you know, our summers have been getting hotter. They've been getting drier. I think it was the month of May last year that was pretty much a drought. So if you put a plant in the spring, like beginning of May, then all of a sudden the temperatures go up into the low 30s and there's no rain and you're just doing triage with a watering can. To me, that's a lot more maintenance. You'll get more plant selection in the spring, but for myself, I find that it is better to plant in the fall.
Great, there's a few more in the chat. One was, have you heard if alternate leaf dogwood will get canker?
Yes, the dogwoods can be prone to disease in general. So what you need to do with, so do your research first, because it's easy enough to find out what the diseases are, especially foliar diseases that may affect them. For something that gets canker or any kind of foliar disease, you'll want to make sure, A, that it's planted correctly and that the soil is not up too high. You want to make sure that it's watered enough, and you'll also want to make sure it has good air circulation. So if trees are stressed out, They don't get enough water, or they get too much water. They're planted too deep, or they're crowded together. That's when they're under stress, and they will suffer ill effects. There's no getting around it. Trees are living things, and some are healthier than others. I've also had the experience, because I live on a large property, I never plant one of anything. I plant at least 3 of everything. And it's very interesting to me, because I'll buy them from the same nursery and they will come from the same stock. One tree will do brilliantly. Another one will be okay, and another one will get sick and die. So we also have to remember that, some trees are healthier than others, but we do whatever we can to provide good conditions. If you're concerned about plants that get sick, look for the ones that are the toughest. Plant a maple, plant an oak, and ask at the garden center and do your research. Like if you want a crabapple, a lot of them suffer from a lot of foliar disease. I won't plant one unless I see it's got good resistance to fire blight and scab and all that sort of thing.
Great, and maybe one more tree question before we move on, because I think I know I also have this question, but this one from the chat. I currently have a very large and healthy Norway maple on my property. Do you recommend removing it and replacing it with natives? I recognize that large trees provide a lot of carbon sequestration benefits, but this is an invasive tree.
It is. Leave it, because it is providing a lot of benefits. So it provides shade. It sucks up a lot of stormwater. It would take you 60 to 70 years to replace the benefit that tree is providing right now. All we're saying is, if it dies, take it down and don't replace it with another one. Please don't plant a Norway maple. They are beautiful. It's hard to say that. I mean, some of them are absolutely gorgeous. You will find it extremely challenging to plant underneath. Nothing grows underneath them. They're very shallow rooted. You can plant some stuff, but it's tough. But I would never take down a healthy tree. It's sequestering a lot of carbon. It is ameliorating air pollution, and it is ameliorating urban heat island effect. So do not take it down. There are a lot of them. Just we don't want to plant anymore, and take out as many seedlings as you possibly can. Don't pass them along to your neighbors.
Great. There's several more. I think some of them you might answer in the second half of your presentation, though. So do we want to?
Yeah, so we'll carry on. I tend to go on too long chatting, so I'm going to try to keep it briefer today so that there's a lot of time to answer any questions you may have. So we look at a number of different layers in the landscape. The top layer, of course, is the trees. The middle layer is the shrubs. The bottom layer is the perennials or the forbs. When I first started gardening, I did not like shrubs. I did not want any of them. I did not see the value of them, because all I ever saw was shrubs that were kind of ugly and overgrown. Things like bridal spirea, that was a one-shot wonder. 2 weeks in the spring, that's it. Or forsythia, same thing, 2 weeks in the spring, that's it. And they were never pruned. And so I ended up with a garden that had up at the top and at the bottom and nothing in the middle. Well, shrubs are amazing plants. I have completely changed my tune. They do provide a focal point in the landscape. They provide biomass. So just as we were talking about that Norway maple having a lot of biomass, the shrubs also provide biomass. And they manage stormwater through infiltration and evapotranspiration. And they also provide a lot of eco benefits to the wildlife. Flowers for pollinators, and fruit for the birds. Now, this graphic is taken straight out of the Reep Rain Garden Handbook, and these are some of the native shrubs that are in our area. And as you can see, they grow pretty big. So if you look at that red osier dogwood, the Cornus sericea, right there, top middle, I have a row of those in front of our porch. Beautiful, vivid red stems all winter. Every year, I cut them down to the ground. Every year, they grow up 9 feet. Now, not everybody has room for that. So these native shrubs are lovely, but they are not small. And in fact, these are very, what I say, they're not exactly accurate measurements. I find that they grow much bigger. So the elderberry, that one easily will grow in the right conditions, 12 feet tall and wide. I've got one that's 15 feet tall and wide. So they get big. Now, if you don't have room for a big one in your garden, do not despair. This is where some of the cultivars come in, and I'm going to call them nativars. So the nursery industry knows that people really want to plant native plants, but they don't have room for a lot of them. So they're working like maniacs to develop ones that people will buy. Now, unlike the trees, remember I said that the small pines and the small spruce and the small junipers, they don't necessarily have a lot of benefits to the wildlife. They just look beautiful in your garden, and they look beautiful. So plant them if you want them. But you do have options of plants that are beneficial in the shrub family. So here we have the Cornus sericea. There are a number of other Cornus varieties as well, and it grows at least 8 to 10 feet tall and wide. You can buy Cornus sericea kelsey, which literally grows 2 to 3 feet tall and wide. It's as cute as a button. Does it have exactly the same benefits as the native species? That's under discussion. I do know that it flowers, the pollinators use it. I do know that it fruits and the birds eat it. I do know that it has these beautiful red stems that suck up stormwater. So if you had an edge of a rain garden and you wanted something very neat and tidy, you could put in the Kelsey dogwood. I use the Kelsey dogwood a lot as a hedge. So instead of using a yew hedge or a boxwood hedge, neither of which have any semblance to any native plant here, except for Taxus canadensis, which is hardly ever used, use something like this, and all of a sudden you've increased the ecological benefits on your property, and it is developed very closely to our native dogwood. The 9-bark. Now this is, I love all plants, but I have to tell you that the 9-bark in its native state is not really a thing of beauty. It's kind of a gangly plant. It doesn't look particularly nice, but look at those flower clusters. Any bee that goes to one of those has hit bonanza. They don't have to go very far because there's dozens of small flowers on that ball. Now, this is one of those plants that has been proved very easy to be hybridized. It now comes in just about any color of the rainbow. So if you don't have room for the 9-bark, again, 8 to 10 feet tall and wide, you can get the tiny wine 9-bark. It's beautiful burgundy foliage. It's 4 feet tall and wide. It has lovely flowers, and it's just as tidy as can be. It's beautiful. There are golden 9-barks, there are orange 9-barks, there are copper 9-barks. And in my experience, I think I have 6 different kinds of 9-barks on our property. I've looked to see if there's any difference in the approach of the pollinators to the 9-barks, and they love them all. They are just wonderful plants. They come in a variety of sizes and a variety of colors, so extremely ornamental and extremely beneficial, and just as tough as nails. So this is our native holly, Ilex verticillata winterberry. So it's not the hard evergreen spiky holly that you associate with Christmas. And it has these wonderful red berries that provide food over the winter for birds. Now, this is where you need to really do some research as to what kind of soil you've got and where the water is on your property, because this one ain't happy unless it's got its feet wet. It needs to be in a damp location. Again, it makes a very big thicket when it's 6 to 8 feet tall and wide. But again, you can get a lovely little one, red sprite. Look at that in the winter. You can imagine what that looks like against snow. 3 feet tall and wide, very compact. The birds will be extremely happy if you provide that for them. Now, we're going to come to my true love, which is perennials. So the perennials, everybody loves them. Bloom in a box, buy one. They're wonderful perennials in there. They provide color in the garden, and they attract pollinators with an abundant source of nectar. Remember, I said there's a difference between feeding and habitat. So the birds, the bees, the moths, the butterflies, everybody goes nuts in a perennial garden in the summer, as long as they are plants that provide nectar. So some plants don't. Some of those annuals that you're buying at the garden center, nobody's going to touch them. But many of our native perennials will work fantastically in your garden, as well as cultivars all. So I'm going to talk about those two things again. So everybody knows echinacea, very popular plant. The two echinacea on the bottom are native to our region. On the left is Echinacea purpurea, and on the right, Echinacea pallida. So purple coneflower and pale coneflower. I think I have 7 or 8 different varieties of Echinacea on this property. And the one on the very top, where the bees feed off of all of them, we have honeybees, so that could be why, is Magnus Echinacea. That is one of my all-time favorites. I love the shape of the cone. I love the color of the petals. It's absolutely beautiful. The one in the middle, I'm not sure whether that's White Angel or if it's Echinacea alba, but I think it could be White Angel. And the one on the right is Raspberry Tart. Isn't that a great name? Now, the Echinacea have been hybridized hundreds of ways. I will specify an echinacea for a property 1 year. I'll go back to specify it for another property the next year, and there's 20 different varieties. I would suggest, it's very confusing, the jury's still out on this, whether or not you should plant these nativars or just the straight natives. But I'm going to go with this. Try to stick with the ones that at least have some bearing on reality. If you're going with an orange echinacea that has hair that sticks up and pom-poms and double florets, it is becoming so far away from the native plant. I think, quite frankly, it becomes confusing to the pollinators. I could be wrong there. But as soon as you start to begin to hybridize for very specific traits, some of the native traits are bred out. It's like with roses. That's the reason some of those really hardy, never get sick roses have no scent. They've been bred for hardiness and there's no scent left, or for color and there's no scent left. So echinacea, there's a wide variety. Try to go with ones that are relatively close to the species. Here's another one I'd like to talk about briefly, because this is one that I used in error for a very long time. Rudbeckia is a native plant. Rudbeckia hirta is a native plant. The one that I always put in clients' gardens was Rudbeckia fulgida goldsturm. It was a completely different one, goldsturm Rudbeckia. The reason I put it in is because once you plant it, it's there forever and it keeps going and it expands, the clump expands in size. The Rudbeckia hirta is what we would call a short-lived perennial. So it may poop out after a year or two, but what it does is it reseeds itself. And this is a much better perennial to use rather than something like a Rudbeckia fulgida, which doesn't have the same specific name as the native series. Now, this one is a great one for pollinators. If we went back to the top species for butterflies, for feeding, number 1 would be Helianthus sunflowers. I think it provides for 50 very specific types of native bees. The second one is goldenrod. Plant that at your peril. Make sure that you have room. It's a wonderful plant. Provides for 42 different species of specific bees. And it's great, but it takes up a lot of space. But very close to it is Rudbeckia hirta. So these plants are great for providing habitat. You can also get Rudbeckia hirta in a wide variety of colors. So you can buy them already as plants, or you can buy the seeds. So, you know, feel free to mix them together. You can put some straight species in, and you can put some in that have some more color. Same with the echinacea. Do some straight species, add some white ones, add maybe a raspberry tart, add a magnus, so that you've got a mixture. So now what we're looking for in our garden is a balanced diet. As much as possible with those trees, stay with the native species. Once you're getting into your shrubs, you can play around a little bit. Perennials and grasses, you can play around even more. But again, look for that balanced diet. You want food for the adults, and you want habitat for the youngsters. I'll speak briefly about grasses. So here we have a combination of Panicum virgatum, which have been hybridized to have colors. So Shenandoah switchgrass is very close to the species, but the flowers are deeper red. Heavy metal switchgrass, isn't that a great name? And then the one on the right, that's straight species prairie dropseed. So again, you could mix some straight species grasses in with some of the cousins to the natives that are a little bit ornamental and create a beautiful garden. Now, the thing that people are worried about when they do native plants is they say it's going to look like a mess. Well, figure out a theme. And one of the easiest things to do is to figure out a color theme so that things look intentional. So in this, if we go clockwise from top left, that is the Shenandoah switchgrass. So that is a variety of a native species. Next to it is Geum trifolium, or Grandpa's whiskers. At the bottom is milkweed. Next to it, where it says hot colors, that's wild columbine. And next to that is Rudbeckia hirta. So you get a variety of plants in this color family that bloom throughout the season, and you've got something that looks planned. Pastels and pinks, that is so easy. There's the pale coneflower, milkweed, woodland phlox, Joe Pyeweed on the bottom there. I love Joe Pyeweed. It's taken over my property and I'm really happy. And that purpley one is anise hyssop, covered with pollinators all the time. Blue is one of just a beautiful, beautiful garden with all of these pinks. Blue is extremely calming. That's a flag iris at the top. Verbena hasta, yeah, verbena, I think that's what it is. Next to it, at the bottom, there's a bluegrass, and next to it is wood blue aster, which again is a great pollinator plant. Again, all natives that will provide beauty in your garden. Or if you have a shade garden, there's all kinds of things. I think that's Carex bebi up there, and a fern, and Tiarella cordifolia, foamflower, and Canadian wild ginger. So try to stick with a theme. Don't try to make a hodgepodge of everything. Make it look intentional so your neighbors don't say that just looks like a mess there. And clumps of things. So your planning is extremely intentional. So here's one that I put in. Don't you love that dog? The woman who took that picture got her dog in that. This is a project that I recently did down on Barton Street, which is the north end of Hamilton. And this was just after it was planted. You can see the trees are a little bit stressed out. But we couldn't do the straight native species of trees. We had to do columnar because it wasn't wide enough between the street and the building. But we have anise hyssop in there. We have Rudbeckia. We have Discampsia, tufted hairgrass. Hard to say that one. We have little blue stem. We have cedars. There's blue-eyed grass in there. There's all kinds of grasses, but because the planting is intentional with things in lines, it looks acceptable. It looks relatively formal. I'm going to show you a couple others from which we can learn. Probably the godfather of them all is Pete Udolph, and this is from the High Line in Chicago. You can see that he's used masses of plantings, and you probably recognize some of these. This is in downtown Chicago. If you're ever in that city, you should go there and take a look at his plantings. This is the Lurie Garden, and it's not straight native species. He blends them. A second one, also in North America, is Adam Woodruff. Again, these are not all native, but he mixes them in. So you have this lovely native yellow plant going up through the middle, and it's coming up through the Russian sage Perovskia, which is not native, but is beloved by pollinators. And you can see he's done these drifts of flowers and clumps of flowers and worked all of the colors together so that it looks like a beautiful picture. And Claudia West and Thomas Rayner, husband and wife team, Planting in a Postmodern World. It's worth looking up their book. You can see that this is an absolutely spectacular planting. Again, it would change over the seasons, but again, it's not all natives. There's a lot of salvias in there. They're not native. I use a lot of them, but they mix them in with the native plants. So they've got lots of habitat for the pollinators, for the fauna. And they're increasing the native species in their area, but they're also using some other ornamentals. So it's not just one or the other. It's many ways of doing things. So I'm going to now, let me see. I'm going to stop sharing and take any questions.
Thanks so much, Adele. There's been a lot of questions. A couple about lawns. So one asked, is it a native plant? And another asked, any suggestions for a healthy grass mix with wildflowers? This person's not planning on moving their backyard lawn.
There is no native turf grass like Kentucky bluegrass, and Kentucky bluegrass is actually not from North America. It spreads by rhizomes, a mat, it creates a carpet. So if you want something that the kids and the dogs can play on, there is no substitute for that. However, there are ways that you can make it healthier. Number one, do you remember that white clover I showed right at the beginning? I said it's not native, but it's pretty happy here. Any lawn should be seeded with at least 20% white clover. It fixes the nitrogen in the soil, which means you don't have to fertilize as much. You can put spring flowering bulbs in there. So you might try, so there's a nodding onion, Allium cernuum, CERNUUM, or just called nodding onion, that comes up very early in the spring. You could put that bulb in your garden and just wait until it's finished flowering to cut the turf. The other thing that you need to make the turf healthier is to cut it as high as possible. So the health of the turf is directly related to the length of the roots. And the length of the roots is directly related to how long it is on top. So the golf greens that you see at the golf that are made out of bent grass, and it's very short, those roots are incredibly shallow, so they have to water it all the time. So when we're looking at lawns, you can put other stuff in them, but I would say the one thing that you want to do is reduce your need for fertilizer and reduce your need for water, because 90% of both of those just run off the lawn and go into the storm sewers, and that's what we want to avoid. So cut the lawn higher, top dress every year with, they would call it a renovator mix, but it would be a perennial, rye, and a fescue mix in there. They are both very hardy, and top dress with very clean compost once a year, and add that clover to your turf, and you'll get a much healthier lawn. But there is no substitute for it here, sorry.
Great, and here's one that others might have a similar question. I have a red osier dogwood that I would like to relocate. It was small and cute when I planted it, but is now, of course, taking over the rest of the garden. Any advice for transplanting? And maybe you can talk about transplanting other native shrubs as well.
Yes, so the best time to transplant, I would say, is in fall when the leaves have gone off and it's dormant. Now that red osier dogwood, you can take the hedge clippers to it and prune it pretty much right to the ground every year. So do not be afraid to prune native plants. So if you are pruning shrubs in general, so this is not foolproof, but it's pretty good. You should prune out a third of that plant every year. You can prune out a third of the stems, and that would be the oldest ones, right down to the ground, and you can head back the other stems by a third. And the idea is that there should be no stems in those shrubs that are more than 3 years old. So what you are doing is constantly renewing the shrubs. This works for Physocarpus, the 9-bark. It works for the dogwood. It works for the, it works for pretty much any shrub, including lilacs. You can cut those suckers right down to the ground and they'll come back. You can't do it with trees. You can't do it with evergreens, but any woody shrub. And then in the fall, you may notice if you go to the garden center in the fall and you go to buy a shrub, they're all only about this high, all of them. And that's because before the winter comes, they cut all of that growth off because they want them to explode again in the spring. So if you want to transplant something, cut it back in the fall and start to dig around very gently, work the soil gently. And some of those, depending on your soil, if it's sandy soil, it's going to come out easily. If you, like me, you live on the Haldeman clay plain, it's going to take some major effort to get it out. Prepare the new planting hole ahead of time before you put it in, but shrubs transplant beautifully. You don't have to be concerned about whether they're too high or too low as you do with trees. And you can also, with the dogwood, if you want some more, you can cut off a stem and just stick it in the ground and it will create a new plant.
Great. And continuing on the pruning theme, is it better to prune trees in the fall?
That is a whole other topic. So there are many kinds of pruning. So some pruning is to reduce growth, some is to encourage fruiting. Let me just say this. You could do some pruning now. Maples will, the sap will run. You could do some pruning now. And here's the 3 things that you should do. You chop out anything that's dead and you don't leave a stub. You chop out anything that's diseased. Chop out, saw out. And the 3rd thing is crossing branches. So if you have a tree and 2 branches are crossing like that, they're going to rub against each other. And what happens is disease enters that. You want to keep the boughs all going out and all having space. So this speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about with the pagoda dogwood. You want to make sure that there's good air circulation throughout your tree. You can, the best time to look at whether or not to prune is before the leaves come out. So just take a look and see. And then I'd say you could prune now, but you might want to do a little bit more research on that because some trees benefit from pruning at different times of the year, and it depends on what kind of pruning you're doing. And that's a whole different topic altogether. But dead, diseased, and crossing branches should be taken out just about any time.
Great. We have lots of questions. I don't know if we'll be able to get to them all, but
I'm willing to stay for a while. So if you're willing to hang with it, I will. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on using biochar in gardens?
I haven't used it yet, and I'm going to experiment with it this year. That's quite a new product, and the reviews so far are pretty good. So I'm going to give it a go. I can get it at my local TSC, used to be called TSC. It's a different store now. If you buy it online, it's pretty expensive, but you only need to use a small quantity. But the reviews coming out seem to be that it is a worthwhile thing.
Great. Here's a fun one. What can I replace periwinkle under a Norway maple with?
Yeah, maybe you just want to leave your pear. No, that's not true. So a less invasive thing, I can't believe I'm saying this, but less invasive but might work well is, believe it or not, hostas. You find a pocket of soil there and plant them in there, but something native under the Norway maples like foam flower, it's just going to die. Wild ginger, it's going to die because it sucks up all of the moisture. So what you would be looking for is a woodland plant, right? And when you think of the woodlands in Ontario, that always means cool and moist and damp. And unfortunately, that Norway maple sucks absolutely everything up. So that's the problem. That's the problem with them right there. That's why nothing's growing on the ground in the ravines in Toronto. If something could, it would. Nature abhors a vacuum. Nature doesn't like empty space. But underneath those Norway maples, it's a problem. You could try coralberry, Symphora. The coralberry is a vine and it would spread to about 10 feet. You could try planting that at a distance and see if it would cover that area eventually. It would be worth a try.
Thanks. If you buy a tree during the year and it is in a pot, is it okay to water it and nurture it and then plant it in the fall?
No, plant it, get it out of that pot, get it in the soil. And so I would just tell people, don't buy stuff in July and August. It is very stressful. You will not be able to plant that tree. You will not be able to water that tree enough. I've tried it and stuff has died. You'd have to have it in a very sheltered location. It would have to be a big pot. The longer the trees stay in that pot, the worse it is for them. The roots start to grow around the pot. They grow in a circular fashion. And once those roots start to girdle, they may continue to do that for the life of the tree. I would say you need to get it out of the pot ASAP.
And here's one that people will be thinking about coming up. Are we supposed to try to eliminate what was called the gypsy moth is now called the spongy moth or the LDD moth? Are we supposed to try to eliminate those caterpillars as food for birds or risk losing the tree?
Yes, please. You remember one of the definitions of invasive is that it's causing harm, and those are causing harm. They are defoliating forests. They are defoliating trees. Those please show no mercy. You can find information on how to get rid of them. If I find caterpillars nested in a tree, I'll break it open with a stick and hopefully the birds can get at them. But really, the spongy moth, anything that you can do to get rid of it, please do.
Great. And are there any shrubs that do well in shade?
Yes, there are tons of shrubs that do well in shade. The dogwoods do well in shade, the 9-barks in partial shade. I would just tell you to look up native shade shrubs. There are, I'm starting to go brain dead, I apologize. There are tons of them. But also when we talk about native in our region with climate change, native plants are changing their habitat. So what we call the Annabelle hydrangea or Hydrangea arborescens is actually native just a little way south of here. So I have no hesitation in putting Annabelle hydrangeas in a garden because they are native to North America and they thrive in the shade. Oh, oak leaf hydrangea, that's a nice native shrub as well. But just do Google it. There are quite a number of shrubs that will do well in the shade. Almost no evergreens. Almost all evergreens require full sun.
All right, and let's in keeping with the plant recommendations, maybe I'll lump 2 questions together. One is any suggestions for native ground covers? And a similar question is there a native that will overtake periwinkle and English ivy?
I don't think there is a native that will overtake them. I just saw somebody coming up saying that wild ginger is overtaking their garden. I'd be curious whether that's the European wild ginger or the Canadian wild ginger, because there are two different varieties. So ground covers, the foam flower is absolutely gorgeous. So if you're in shade, the Tiarella cordifolia is beautiful. There's the straight native species, and there are also all kinds of varieties that have been developed from that with different kinds of flowers. There are, the wild ginger is good. There are a number of grasses, small grasses, carex, that do well as a ground cover. I generally would recommend a combination of plants. So if you looked at that slide that I had, that was all green, a lot of those plants were ground cover plants. They're woodland plants. Short perennials.
Great. And continuing on our plant recommendations, are there any native edible vegetables?
Well, corn, squash. But I'm thinking, are you thinking, if you're thinking perennial plants, I can't think of any, but there are tons of edibles just outside your door. So for instance, if you have burdock, the stems of burdock are completely edible. If you have dandelions, every part of that plant is edible. If you have chicory, every part of that plant is edible. If you have stinging nettle, that plant is edible. There are tons of native flowers that are edible. All of the violets, there are many. Yeah, I would be looking to First Nations diet for that. I mean, you know, the Three Sisters everywhere in North America. But those would be heritage varieties. So for instance, the apples are native here, but there are hundreds of varieties of apples, but they are certainly native. There's no question. That's a huge discussion. But yes, many vegetables are native to our region, but I'd also, more just in terms of sheer interest, I'd be looking at some of those other edible wild plants, like the dandelions, the chicory, the burdock, you know, there's just so many, portulaca, there's so many things that we call weeds. Jerusalem artichokes, thank you. There are so many ramps. There's tons of them. There's a wealth of food out there that we do not think of as food, because we're so married to what we've gotten in the supermarket. I'd encourage you to explore that more.
Great. And how about we close by lumping together 3 pruning questions? How does that sound? So we've talked about pruning a lot.
Yeah, well, it's a topic. Yeah.
I found a patch of nannyberry and relocated a few in the fall. Should I cut them back to the ground or leave them at their original height? They're around 2.5 feet tall.
Oh, leave them, leave them. Nannyberries are so wonderful. They are so wonderful, those plants. So I didn't even talk about the viburnums. That's, you know, I just wanted to sort of give you some ideas, but the viburnums, they're a huge family. Viburnum lantana, Viburnum lantago, Viburnum dentatum, which is the arrowwood viburnum. Fantastic plants. Quite a number of them. But the nannyberry, I just let them go. They'll get about 6 feet wide and maybe 10 feet tall. Wonderful plants.
Great. And I feel like we've gone 10 minutes over, so that that might wrap it up.
There are lots of resources available online. If you're looking for pruning, I'm going to recommend one man, and his name is Lee Reich, Lee R-E-I-C-H, Lee Reich. He has a pruning handbook, everything you need to know. Lee Reich will tell you. An amazing resource.
Great. And somebody was asking if you do consultations. So may I share your website in the chat for them?
Sure. Yes, you may. You may. It was a pleasure to be with you all. I've enjoyed this.
Thanks so much, Adele, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Take care and happy spring.
Okay, happy planting. Bye.